Super Sabre is a legendary aircraft. Originally a basic day fighter, it would be transformed into a multi-role workhorse, flying more sorties than any other USAF fighter in the Vietnam War, from air support to SEAD and electronic warfare. Early on, it was hoped it would be America's next air superiority fighter, but after entering service, it was decided that a better role for it would be air-to-ground. In fact, the F-100 would become an early strike fighter. By the time of its active duty retirement in 1972, it had taken a back seat to newer, more technologically advanced aircraft such as the Phantom. Yet, despite its shortcomings, the F-100 was, for most of its life, an integral part of the US Air Force. And just a reminder, if you want to support our channel, please check out our merch store or become a member. This all helps keep the channel running. And we also have an Instagram at peacemaker.aviation. Links in the description. Enjoy the video.
In December 1950, the F-86 first arrived in Korea. Its combat debut against the MiG-15 marked the beginning of the jet age in air combat. Culminating in the definitive F-86F, which arrived in 1953, the Sabre was arguably the first truly capable fighter the US Air Force had received since the P-51D. Yet despite its success, it soon became evident that the Soviets would eventually outclass it. Years earlier, just after production of the Sabre had begun in 1949, North American Aviation had drawn up a proposal for a next-generation evolution of it, internally designated Sabre 45. In January 1951, North American then sent the proposal to the Air Force, followed by a mock-up 5 months later. By November, it was redesignated XF-100, and by January 3rd the next year, the Air Force had decided to order 2 YF-100 prototypes, followed by 23 initial production models. The YF-100 would be a large aircraft, 14 meters long, with an 11.2 meter wingspan swept 45 degrees, 4 20mm cannons, a maximum takeoff weight of nearly 29,000 pounds, and a single XJ-57 engine producing 13,200 pounds of thrust, a down-rated engine compared with what would be on the production jet. The first prototype, 52-5754, took its maiden flight on May 25, 1953, several months ahead of schedule. In an impressive performance test, even with a down-rated engine, the jet reached Mach 1.05. The second prototype, 5755, took to the skies on October 14th for further testing. Yet, while the initial flights proved the aircraft to be both fast and somewhat advanced for its time, issues soon became evident, which would define the early stages of its life. The new design was fast, however, it was aerodynamically dangerous. The deadliest issue the aircraft faced was inertia coupling, a problem experienced by several other supersonic concepts of the time. From the YF-100, this issue had been noted, but the true danger wouldn't be felt until October 12, 1954, once the F-100A had entered production. On that day, North American's chief test pilot George Welch took the 9th production F-100A for a flight. He was to execute a planned 7.5 G pull-up out of a Mach 1.5 dive to verify the airframe's strength. Gaining speed in the dive, the aircraft suddenly departed from controlled flight before completely disintegrating. Welch's death was a major upset. He had been one of the 2 P-40 pilots who had taken off during the attack on Pearl Harbor, and throughout his career had refined his skills. His death highlighted just how troublesome the inertia coupling and directional control problems were on the new aircraft. Beyond this, despite retaining some shaping from the older Sabre, the F-100 wasn't particularly agile. In a dogfight, it suffered from a long list of issues, including a small tail fin, wings and general shaping that retained energy reasonably well at speed, but at low speeds and high alpha, handling was unforgiving. Designers had placed the horizontal stabilizer low to avoid wing turbulence while pulling high AOAs, yet this didn't resolve more serious issues. Once slow, the aircraft became sluggish and hard to control, and thanks to the 45-degree wing sweep, any high AOA maneuvers were extremely risky. Notably, pilots found that aileron inputs at high AOAs and lower speeds would result in adverse yaw, meaning rudder inputs had to be used instead to try to direct the nose. At the time, this was quite troubling. Eastern Bloc fighters, namely the MiG-17 and MiG-19, were far more agile and still relatively fast, and new Soviet prototypes, like the Ye-1 and Ye-4, were paving the way for a newer, Mark II-capable fighter interceptor. If forced into the merge, the F-100's only guaranteed advantage was raw power.
Yet the problems didn't end there. The J-57 engines were powerful, designed for high speed, yet were slow to spool up. Afterburners sometimes had delay, throttle bursts could surge fuel and stall the compressor, and in a turn fight, turbulent air through the intake could stall or even completely jam parts of the turbine. And to top it off, the F-100 quickly developed an infamous heat-related maintenance issue around the aft of the fuselage during prolonged afterburner use. Nevertheless, Tactical Air Command urgently needed something fast to fill the day fighter role. In 1954, the initial F-100A would enter production.
Following the YF-100's first flight in May 1953, the first production F-100A flew in October that year. Deliveries to operational units commenced in 1954, and by September 27th, the Super Sabre officially entered US Air Force service, eventually earning the nickname Hun, short for 100. Outwardly, it differed little from the prototypes, save for one critical change. The vertical tail was reduced as part of efforts to optimize high-speed performance. However, as mentioned earlier, this also reduced directional stability and damping at supersonic speeds. The issues the 100A presented could not be ignored, and after complaints from pilots, all 70 delivered units were grounded in November 1954. Over the course of 3 months, the fleet was retrofitted with a larger tail and a modified wing, and production resumed the following year. Despite its flaws, the delivered product boasted impressive specs. It was both fast and large, armed with 420mm cannons, with hardpoints for two 275-gallon drop tanks, and powered by a powerful J57P39 engine. The 100A would have a 45,000-foot service ceiling, something unmatched in later models, a top speed of Mach 1.3, and a combat radius of around 350 nautical miles. Pilot testimony from the time describes it as difficult but impressive. In one case, pilots noted bouncing off the runway on takeoff because the earliest manuals claimed the rotation speed was 145 knots, 15 knots below stalling speed. Needless to say, this was quickly revised. Yet, despite the issues faced, the Hun would be drawn upon for several offshoot programs. ZEL, a rocket-assisted zero-length takeoff method, was introduced later in 1958. The other project of note occurred in late 1953, before the 100A's formal entry into service. The CIA and US Air Force, needing a stopgap while the U-2 was being built, sent a request for 6 recon-modified F-100s, each equipped with 5 aerial survey cameras, to be designed and built in 3 weeks, designated Project Slick Chick. They had to fly at 53,000 feet for 5 hours and have the photographic resolving power to see a white golf ball on green turf from that altitude. The deadline was actually met, with 7 built, although beyond deployments to Germany, Turkey and Taiwan, the many operational details remain obscure or were only partially declassified. Yet by the late 50s, with 203 units built, the 100A as a fighter would find itself increasingly irrelevant. It had never actually replaced the Sabre as a dedicated air dominance platform. In fact, as some US Air Force officers later noted in the 70s, the Sabre had no true successor in this sense until the F-15A. At the same time, without a capable radar or Mach 2 capability, as an interceptor, it was limited at best, blind to threats in poor weather or at night. While later retrofits were made to the 100A, including increased stores capacity, sidewinder compatibility, and limited air-to-ground weapons, the Alpha model was essentially a dead end, filling a dayfighter role for only a short period in the mid-50s before being outclassed. During pre-production in 1953, likely anticipating the future, a second derivative was drawn up to fill an interceptor role. The F-100B would be proposed, but due to evident problems with the F-100A, the Air Force shifted its focus back to the F-102. As time went on, the 100B idea was developed into the F-107, a fighter bomber which, while a whole other topic in itself, would ultimately lose out on a contract to the F-105. Nevertheless, in November 1953, following a month-long series of reviews, North American concluded that the F-100 was, in some respects, better than any other Air Force fighter in service that year, likely due to its distinct speed advantage. These reviews also confirmed several crucial deficiencies in the A model. By February 1954, Tactical Air Command recommended cutting the 100A order by 70 airframes and suggested the aircraft be refined into a more capable dayfighter with air-to-ground capabilities. In this way, it could provide troop support or, if needed, deliver nuclear weapons. The resulting 100C would attempt just that, first flying in March 1954. Powered by the new J-57P-21, it was faster than the 100A, with a more robust wing, aerial refueling, and new drop tanks to further extend range. It would be procured in two sub-variants. The earliest deliveries were NA-214, and the rest were NA-217, the latter featuring a more comprehensive air-to-ground overhaul. In total, 476 would be built, but this would be just the beginning of the Super Sabre's life, which up to this point had been somewhat confused. The 100C proved that the platform was arguably better in air-to-ground than in air-to-air, and soon the decision would be made to push it even further. At the request of Tactical Air Command, development of the definitive variant of the aircraft would begin in October 1954. The F-100D would be both safer and more capable in air-to-ground operations than the 100C. It first flew on January 24, 1956, and the list of upgrades and modifications was extensive. To aid safety, the fin was enlarged by 25%, and the wing was both enlarged and further strengthened. As a result, it featured 6 hardpoints, increasing ordnance capacity from 5,000 pounds in the 100C to 7,000 pounds. The weapons options were also expanded, ranging from standard dumb bombs to rockets, napalm, and even early guided weapons such as the Bolt 117 and the AGM-12 Bullpup. From the 184th production airframe onwards, sidewinder compatibility was also added. Internally, the avionics were also overhauled. New flaps gave the wing a cranked trailing edge, and a Honeywell MB3 autopilot, a new gun sight, and the gyro-assisted low-altitude bombing system, LABS, were added. A faster refueling method, a cartridge starter, and a revised, safer fuel system were also integrated. Yet perhaps the most interesting new feature was the APR-25, or RAW, an early type of radar warning receiver. As many are now aware, the system used an archaic method of visualizing threats. There were no boxed numbers corresponding to radar types. Instead, lines indicated particular frequencies, shown as solid, dashed, or dotted. Amplitude and signal strength were indicated by the length and clarity of the line, and the same familiar circular dial was used to visualize threat bearing.
The end result was highly advanced for its time. It was safer than the 100C, better in air combat than the 100A, and had better range, better payload, and a far more capable internal suite of systems. Entering service in 1956, 1,274 100Ds would roll off the production line and quickly become the Air Force's go-to fighter bomber. The final major derivative would arrive shortly after. In March 1957, the twin-seat F-100F entered production. Now, it had been designed as a trainer, but in the years that followed, the decision was made to convert some of the 339 F-100Fs into a combat-ready platform.
By the late 1950s, the Super Sabre's role as a fighter bomber was a given. In just half a decade, the speed records set by the F-100 were completely outdone by newer jets, such as the Mach 2 Phantom and the MiG-21. Air-to-ground was evidently where the aircraft now excelled. It was more expendable than the brand new F-4C and, apart from payload capacity, could demonstrate similar precision. The 100D had a gyro-assisted bombing system and a simple set of dials for calculating manual bombing or rocket salvos. This is worth noting, since the Phantom wouldn't receive proper computer bombing until 1967, when the F-4D added WRCS, making the Hun among the most precise in the strike role up to that point. Thus, when hostilities flared up in Vietnam, the F-100 would be among the first from the Air Force to respond. By the time the Vietnam War commenced, the Super Sabre was already in the region. Since 1961, deployments had maintained an Air Force presence in Thailand, and by June 1964, the first combat sorties were being flown against insurgents in Laos. The Air Force's decision to employ it directly in Vietnam followed early the next year, with the Super Sabre suddenly tasked with long-range fighter escort and ground attack into the north under Operation Rolling Thunder. Then, on April 4th that year, 1965, the Hun would claim its only probable air-to-air victory. Over the course of the day, 100Ds were tasked with flying MiG-cap for a Thunder Chief strike package and holding off the coast for ResCap. As the story goes, MiG-17s had snuck past the MiG-cap flight and were ingressing towards the Thunder Chiefs from the Gulf of Tonkin. The ResCap flight pushed in instead, and diving from 20,000 feet, Captain Don Kilgus got into a firing envelope and shot a MiG with his 20mm cannons. He claimed to have blown off parts of the stabilizer and pulled out of the fight at 7,000 feet, losing sight of the MiG as it continued diving into the thick ocean haze. Since there was no solid evidence of a kill, it never went on record, but if it had, it would have been the Americans' first proper air-to-air victory of the war, just days before the F-4B scored its first kill on April 9th, 1965. A further expansion of the F-100's role came soon after. In mid-1965, US intelligence confirmed the presence of SA-2s in North Vietnam. With Operation Rolling Thunder underway, the threat they posed to bombers was immense. The response was Iron Hand, a joint Navy-Air Force operation focused on suppressing both surface-launched missile sites and radar-assisted AAA. The scope of Iron Hand would see many aircraft put to use, but during the operation's formative months, the SEAD method remained largely unclear. In response, Wild Weasel 1 was initiated. In November 1965, 7 F-100Fs assigned to the 354th Tactical Fighter Squadron were modified under a highly classified program, receiving equipment to track and destroy radar emplacements. In December, the first 4 aircraft began flying these daring sorties. After locating a site on RAW, the crew would ingress down low, using rockets or bombs to suppress it. Once the signal was neutralized, F-105s would fly in and destroy it. Soon after, a further 3 100Fs joined, with their first recorded victory against an SA-2 occurring on December 22nd. Over the 45-day classified program, the 16-man crew paid a heavy price. 4 were killed, 2 were taken prisoner, a further 3 were wounded, and 2 more quit in response. The operation was ended. This catastrophic outcome, nevertheless, pushed Iron Hand forward. While Navy Skyhawks had access to the Shrike, the brave Sabre pilots were less agile and limited to dumb bombs and rockets, with no jamming, meaning every engagement was life or death. It highlighted the importance of standoff distances, and as a result, the following SEAD operations adopted better tactics. Wild Weasel 3 began the proper use of jamming, decoying, and long-range anti-radiation missiles, while Wild Weasel 5 would further refine the process. With these experiences behind them, Super Sabre crews were retasked more broadly. Most long-range fighter escort and strike missions into the north were assigned to the Thunder Chief and Phantom. The F-100 would instead be kept further south for the most part, mainly on call for close air support where it excelled. Since 1962, a rolling upgrade program had been run on the 100C. Accelerated by the war, these upgrades soon expanded, referred to as high wire, to encompass all major derivatives of the aircraft. Between 1967 and 1971, the project upgraded and standardized everything from wiring to internal avionics across the platforms, making them better and more robust. This period would also see the 100F put back on the front line. From the outset of the war, a persistent challenge for pilots was locating targets. Flying heavy, fast aircraft in poor visibility, finding enemies was difficult. Fixed positions, like buildings or bridges, were easy to locate and hit, while close air support usually meant eyes on the ground and real-time radio chatter to guide pilots onto target. Yet beyond this, the convoys of Viet Cong traffic flowing into the south were difficult to locate. Strikes along the Ho Chi Minh Trail had been extensive, ranging from carpet bombing sorties to more precise missions. Yet in most cases, effectiveness was questionable. Precision strikes clearly worked better, but often were reliant on photo recon, which had to be sent for processing. Orders then filtered through the various command nodes until they reached a relevant squadron, at which point the convoy's position may no longer be within the calculated area. Other approaches could be taken, such as ground teams. An acoustic sensor network was also in the works, later codenamed Igloo White. Yet, forward air control remained the go-to, with a two-man crew able to dynamically locate and either relay or laze target positions, although the speed of standard FAC aircraft had proven dangerous. Under Commando Sabre, a small group of experienced pilots were assembled. They were to train for and then execute a specialized tasking referred to as fast-forward air control. 16 pilots were initially chosen, 4 of whom were already FACs and trained the others. Pilots volunteered for either 120 days or 75 FAC missions, whichever came first. The missions were dangerous, but quickly proved effective. Flying at 450 knots below 5,000 feet, crews would head along the Ho Chi Minh Trail or into RP-1 in the north, just across the border, and look for signs of troop or vehicle movement, such as dust-covered trees and recut roads, anything that indicated recent movement. Once targets were located, airstrikes were called in. Over the radio, they were given the call sign Misty, which soon became the unit's unofficial name. It was taxing work, with sorties lasting between 4 and 6 hours, often in the north under AAA fire, and with aerial refueling intervals across the border. Yet the crews were finding real targets, and the success rate was high. By 1968, the Navy was also using Misty FACs for assistance. By the end of the year, Misty had flown 1,441 combat sorties and directed 3,988 strikes. A further 1,530 sorties and 2,300 strikes had been flown by the end of 1969. Despite the success, the highly secretive Misty would eventually disband in May 1970. Of the 93 pilots who would serve in the unit, over a quarter had been shot down at least once, and the platform itself was showing its age. Yet Misty did validate the fast FAC role, and while the unit was disbanded, the role itself continued, taken up by the Phantom instead. By the end of the war, the Super Sabre had proven itself incredibly effective and durable. At its peak, in 1969, 490 F-100s were in Vietnam, and during its service from 1964 to 1971, it had flown an incredible 360,000 sorties, the most of any jet in the war. 186 were lost to enemy fire, 45 to accidents, 7 to ground forces, and 0 in air-to-air. The legacy of the Hun technically ends there. In 1972, the fleet was handed over for National Guard service and phased out by 1979. Abroad, it was a similar story. In 1958, the French received Ds and Fs operating a total of 100 airframes. Some of these actually saw service in Algeria during the 1960s, eventually replaced by the Jaguar. Denmark followed in 1959, receiving 72 D and Fs. Turkey also followed, receiving CD and Fs, which were used in combat during the 1974 Cyprus invasion. Lastly, Taiwan would receive the 100A in 1959, operating over 100 in total. Using these old airframes, Taiwan kept them in the air longer than anyone else, finally retiring them in 1988.
As a whole, the F-100 was far from perfect. It was not a particularly agile fighter, nor was it safe, but it was adaptable. And when the time came, it proved itself to be one of the most reliable cornerstone platforms for the US Air Force.
Thanks for watching. Our videos are researched, written and produced by a small team of filmmakers dedicated to bringing you accurate military aviation history from around the world. Please consider supporting us by joining our merch and members site for early access, bonus content and merch discounts, or become a YouTube channel member for early access, or simply hit subscribe. Your support means everything.